It is 8:30 p.m. on September 7th, 1943. An Italian military ambulance navigates the darkening streets on the outskirts of Rome, its engine the only sound in the tense night air. Inside sit two men wearing American uniforms, stripped of all rank, identification, and personal history. To any observer, they are nothing more than downed airmen, American prisoners of war being moved to a detention facility. Suddenly, the vehicle slows as a German patrol steps into the road, flashlights cutting through the gloom. A German soldier leans in close, his face just inches from the window, close enough for the Americans to smell the stale tobacco on his breath. For a heartbeat, the entire future of the Italian campaign hangs on whether this soldier checks their papers or simply waves them through. When he finally motions for the driver to proceed, the relief is cold and sharp. If you were sitting in the back of that ambulance, knowing that a single suspicious glance meant a firing squad, would you have been able to keep your expression blank? The man in that ambulance was no ordinary soldier. He was Brigadier General Maxwell Taylor, the artillery commander of the legendary 82nd Airborne Division. He wasn't in Rome to surrender. He was there because, at that very moment, hundreds of Allied transport planes were being fueled and loaded with thousands of paratroopers across the Mediterranean. These men were prepared to jump into the heart of the Eternal City in less than 24 hours, a maneuver intended to decapitate the German occupation in one swift, daring stroke. But Taylor knew something his superiors in the safety of North Africa didn't. The plan was built on a foundation of sand. He had volunteered for this mission not to lead an attack, but to verify if the attack was even possible. Why do we celebrate the generals who lead the charge, but often forget the ones who have the guts to stand alone and say no? This operation, known as Giant 2, was the ultimate high-stakes gamble of the Mediterranean theater. The Allied High Command was intoxicated by the idea of a quick victory, believing that the Italian government's recent secret armistice would turn the tide instantly. They envisioned paratroopers dropping onto Roman airfields, met by cheering Italian crowds and full logistical support. But while the maps in the war room showed a clear path to glory, the reality on the streets of Rome was becoming a nightmare of German steel and Italian indecision. Taylor was the only check against a looming disaster that threatened to wipe out the finest airborne unit in the world. When a plan sounds too perfect to be true, is it usually the result of military genius or just a dangerous lack of information? As Taylor moved deeper into the occupied city, the weight of 3,000 lives sat squarely on his shoulders. He was hunting for the truth in a place where everyone was lying, sometimes even to themselves. The Italians promised trucks, fuel, and security, but as Taylor looked out the ambulance window at the increasing number of German tanks, he realized the Allied intelligence was catastrophically wrong. The 2 battalions they expected were actually 2 full panzer divisions, waiting like a coiled spring. In a world where high-ranking officials often prioritize their own reputations over the lives of their subordinates, how rare is it to find a leader willing to risk his own life just to save his men from a mistake he didn't even make? But understanding how Taylor ended up sweating in the back of that ambulance requires looking at the dangerously optimistic environment of Allied High Command just a few weeks prior. In the late summer of 1943, the fascist regime had fractured, Mussolini was gone, and the new Italian government secretly agreed to an armistice. Allied leadership smelled blood in the water and drafted Operation Giant 2 with terrifying speed, envisioning the 82nd Airborne dropping directly onto Roman airfields to seize the capital in one decisive night. The planners in Algiers and London were operating purely on momentum, convinced that Italian forces would eagerly provide the trucks, fuel, and security needed to make the operation a masterpiece of modern warfare. When a strategic victory seems just one daring maneuver away, how easy is it for brilliant military minds to confuse a best-case scenario with a guaranteed outcome? The enthusiasm in those distant map rooms was practically deafening, but there was one fiercely dissenting voice, and it belonged to the man whose soldiers were being volunteered for the jump. General Matthew Ridgway, the legendary commander of the 82nd Airborne, looked at the compressed timeline and immediately recognized the blueprint for an impending slaughter. He saw that the entire operation rested on razor-thin intelligence and the vague, unverified promises of an Italian military apparatus that was already crumbling under the shadow of German occupation. Ridgway was a pioneer of airborne warfare who never shied away from a brutal fight, but he understood the fatal difference between a calculated assault and an unsupported sacrifice. If the commander of the most elite airborne division in the world tells you a plan is functionally impossible, what kind of institutional arrogance does it take to simply brush his warnings aside? Realizing that his immediate superiors were blinded by the allure of capturing Rome, Ridgway took a massive professional gamble and took his objections directly to General Alexander, the Allied ground commander. He pleaded for the operation to be canceled, laying out the logistical nightmare of dropping lightly armed infantry into a heavily fortified urban center without guaranteed armor support. Alexander politely but firmly declined, assuring Ridgway that Allied ground troops would simply fight their way up the treacherous Italian peninsula to relieve the paratroopers within 5 days, a promise entirely detached from the grim reality of mountainous warfare. Ridgway walked out of that briefing knowing his concerns had been formally noted and completely ignored, leaving his division preparing to jump into a void. How many catastrophic defeats in human history share this exact same origin story? A senior leader prioritizing the momentum of a beautiful plan over the desperate warnings of the people who actually have to execute it. But proving Ridgway right meant staring directly into the abyss. The entire invasion plan balanced precariously on a single, drastically outdated intelligence estimate. Allied planners believed only 2 German battalions, roughly 1,500 men, were stationed near Rome. It was a serious obstacle, certainly, but nothing a coordinated airborne drop and overwhelming Italian support couldn't handle. Yet, as Taylor began pulling at the threads of intelligence inside the occupied city, the illusion unraveled into a horrifying reality. Those 2 battalions were actually 2 fully equipped Panzer Grenadier divisions. The 3rd Panzer Grenadier alone boasted 24,000 heavily armed soldiers and 150 tanks. The 82nd Airborne was preparing to drop 3,000 lightly armed infantrymen directly into the crosshairs of a massive mechanized army. When the math of war guarantees your destruction, how do you convince the people in charge that their brilliant strategy is actually a suicide pact? The desperate need to stop this impending massacre led Taylor and his companion, Colonel William Gardner, to the Palazzo Caprara, the nerve center of Italian Supreme Headquarters, on the tense evening of September 7th. Every second mattered, as the first wave of American paratroopers was scheduled to load onto planes in mere hours. Yet, instead of finding a bustling command center preparing for liberation, they were shown to quiet third-floor rooms and handed staggering excuses. General Carboni, the man explicitly assigned to defend Rome and support the Americans, was mysteriously absent, and his superior, General Ambrosio, was completely out of town. It became terrifyingly clear that while the Americans were rushing toward a midnight invasion, the Italians were stalling. Have you ever felt the creeping dread of realizing that the people you are relying on for survival are secretly preparing to cut their losses and run? When Carboni finally materialized, the last remnants of Allied optimism were brutally extinguished in a matter of sentences. The Italian general did not mince words. The logistics the Allies were banking on simply did not exist anymore. Under the cover of the uneasy truce, German forces had quietly and efficiently choked off the city, seizing crucial roads, fuel depots, and ammunition dumps right out from under the Italian military's nose. There would be no trucks to transport the paratroopers from the landing zones, no suppression of the deadly anti-aircraft batteries, and absolute zero security at the airfields. The Italians had effectively been neutralized in their own capital before the first shot was even fired. If the very foundation of your survival was stripped away in an instant, would you try to blindly fight through the disadvantage or immediately sound the alarm? The stark conclusion hung in the room like an execution order. Carboni stared down the American envoys and stated definitively that Operation Giant 2 would not liberate Rome. It would merely deliver the 82nd Airborne into a perfectly laid trap. The Germans, vastly underestimated by planners sitting safely in North Africa, were already shifting their heavy armor to cover the exact drop zones the Americans planned to use. Taylor wasn't just dealing with broken promises. He was looking at an active, meticulously designed slaughter that was only hours away from commencement. His objective instantly shifted from coordinating a glorious attack to forcefully dismantling the ambitions of his own commanders. When your superiors demand a historic victory, what kind of psychological toll does it take to be the solitary voice demanding a humiliating retreat? But Taylor was not about to cancel one of the most significant operations of the Second World War based solely on the word of a subordinate general. Even as the reality of the German trap became undeniable, military protocol and the sheer scale of the crisis demanded ultimate verification. He needed to hear it from the very top. Taylor aggressively demanded an immediate, face-to-face meeting with Marshal Pietro Badoglio, the Italian Prime Minister. General Carboni vehemently argued against it, citing the late hour, the danger of moving through the city, and the uselessness of waking the head of state. But the Americans were unyielding. The lives of the 82nd Airborne were not up for debate. Carboni finally relented, personally taking the wheel to drive the two disguised Americans through the heavily patrolled, darkened streets of Rome to Badoglio's private villa. When the standard chain of command completely collapses, how far are you willing to aggressively push the boundaries of protocol to protect the lives of your men? The drive itself was a masterclass in surreal, nerve-wracking tension. Here were two American officers operating completely unprotected behind enemy lines, speeding through a capital city swarming with hostile German troops on their way to drag a national leader out of his bed. When they finally arrived at the heavily guarded villa, the atmosphere was not one of defiance or military readiness, but of quiet, frantic desperation. The fate of the Italian capital, the outcome of the Allied invasion, and the lives of thousands of elite soldiers were about to be decided in the dead of night, in the quiet hallways of a sprawling estate. Can you imagine the sheer audacity and iron nerve required to wake up a foreign head of state in the middle of a global war and demand they openly admit their total defeat? When Marshal Badoglio finally appeared to meet the Americans, the grand illusion of the Italian military resurgence shattered instantly. The Prime Minister did not arrive in a crisp uniform decorated with medals. He shuffled into the room wearing his pajamas. Eyewitness accounts described him as looking profoundly old, exhausted, and utterly defeated. It became immediately obvious to Taylor that Carboni had likely arrived early to brief Badoglio, perfectly synchronizing their story before the Americans walked in. Badoglio did not offer a rallying cry or a desperate alternative plan. He simply confirmed every grim detail Carboni had laid out. The Italian military was paralyzed, the Germans held all the cards, and the airborne operation was a guaranteed suicide mission. If the leader of a sovereign nation looks you directly in the eye and admits his entire military apparatus is powerless, would you gracefully accept the grim reality or desperately search for a silver lining that simply doesn't exist? With the brutal truth finally confirmed at the highest level of government, Taylor and Gardner raced back to the Palazzo Caprara, the clock mercilessly ticking down toward the launch of the invasion. It was now past midnight. Back in North Africa, men were already strapping on their parachutes and boarding transport planes. At exactly 1:21 in the morning on September 8th, Taylor sat at a radio transmitter and composed one of the most consequential, high-pressure messages of the entire war. He drafted an urgent, encrypted flash transmission directly to General Eisenhower's headquarters. Operation Giant 2 was impossible and must be canceled immediately. He had done his job, found the truth, and defied the optimistic momentum of the entire Allied command. But now, he had to wait to see if anyone was actually listening. When you hold the lives of 3,000 soldiers in your hands, and the clock is seconds away from a catastrophic launch, what does the agonizing burden of that final, irreversible decision actually feel like? Taylor sent the encrypted transmission at 1:21 in the morning, plunging himself into a dark, suffocating silence. He was trapped in a hostile city, surrounded by enemy armor, completely blind to whether his warning had actually reached the Allied commanders in North Africa. For hours, he paced the floor of the Palazzo Caprera, sending desperate follow-up messages, hoping against hope that the static of the radio hadn't swallowed his plea. It wasn't until 8 a.m. that he finally received a brief acknowledgement that Eisenhower's headquarters had intercepted the cancellation order. But that simple, bureaucratic confirmation completely masked the terrifying, down-to-the-wire chaos that had just unfolded across the Mediterranean. Have you ever sent a desperate message that could alter the course of your entire life, only to sit in agonizing silence waiting to see if anyone actually read it? While Taylor had been pacing in Rome, the massive, unyielding machinery of the Allied war effort had already been grinding into motion. By the time the decrypted abort message finally reached the right desks in North Africa, transport planes carrying fully equipped paratroopers were already thundering down the runways and lifting into the night sky. The momentum of Operation Giant 2 was practically unstoppable. Men who had been briefed, loaded, and psychologically prepared to fight for their lives were already airborne, heading straight for the German slaughterhouse. An Allied general was forced to physically sprint across the departure airfields, frantically waving down taxiing aircraft, while desperate radio operators broadcast emergency recall codes into the blind void of the night. When the massive, heavy machinery of a global war is already operating at full throttle, how do you slam on the brakes before it drives right off a cliff? High above the dark waters of the Mediterranean, the radio crackled in the cockpits of the lead transports, delivering an order that defied all expectations. Turn back. With only minutes of margin remaining before they crossed the point of no return, the pilots banked their heavy planes around and headed back to base, leaving the paratroopers in the dark about what they had just narrowly avoided. Meanwhile, back in Rome, Taylor received a terse order from Eisenhower at 3 p.m. Return to North Africa immediately. He and Gardner climbed back into their disguised ambulance and sped toward an airfield outside the city for the most nerve-wracking part of their mission. A daylight flight through heavily contested airspace in an unarmed plane. If you had just derailed the grand invasion plans of an entire military theater and were still trapped deep behind enemy lines, how would you handle the terror of flying blindly back out into the open daylight? Taylor spent that entire flight holding his breath, waiting for a German fighter to drop out of the clouds, but the sky remained miraculously empty, and they landed safely on friendly soil. Behind them, however, the fragile illusion of Rome completely shattered, playing out exactly as the defeated Italians had predicted. When the armistice was publicly announced on September 8th, the waiting German armor violently snapped the trap shut. Italian forces were brutally disarmed, resistors were executed on the spot, and Prime Minister Badoglio fled the capital in disgrace. Had the 82nd Airborne jumped as originally planned, they would have drifted down out of the night sky directly into the center of a total, unsupported collapse surrounded by panzers. Knowing that the city you just escaped descended into immediate, violent chaos, how long do you think the haunting what-ifs of that canceled mission would keep you awake at night? To truly understand how close the Allies came to this disaster, we have to look past the individual actors and examine the dangerous psychology of wartime momentum. When Italy flipped sides, the immense pressure to capitalize on that betrayal created a massive, collective blind spot at the highest levels of command. The maps in Algiers weren't drawn with malicious intent, and the Italian generals at the negotiating table weren't necessarily lying when they first offered their logistical support weeks prior. The failure was a deadly combination of stale intelligence and rampant confirmation bias, a desperate desire for a quick victory that overpowered basic military skepticism. The reality on the Italian streets was changing by the minute as German forces tightened their grip, but the plans on the Allied boards remained rigidly, fatally optimistic. When massive resources and political reputations are invested in a singular grand vision, how easy is it for an entire room of brilliant strategists to collectively hallucinate a clear path to victory? This catastrophic disconnect highlights a structural flaw as old as warfare itself. The men who make the plans are rarely the men who bleed for them. General Matthew Ridgway had fought desperately to cancel the parachute drop from his command post, but his objections were overruled simply because he lacked the undeniable boots-on-the-ground proof required to halt the momentum of the war machine. It took Maxwell Taylor stepping into the literal crosshairs of the enemy to shatter the illusion, proving that proximity to danger is often the only thing that can cut through bureaucratic arrogance. He risked a firing squad not to capture a bridge or take a hill, but simply to gather the unvarnished facts that his superiors were too eager to ignore. If the people making the highest stakes decisions are safely insulated from the immediate consequences, can a strict military hierarchy ever truly protect the soldiers it sends into the dark? Yet, despite orchestrating one of the most vital intelligence missions of the 20th century, Maxwell Taylor remains largely overshadowed by the bombastic, headline-grabbing commanders of his era. History builds towering monuments to generals like Patton and MacArthur because we fundamentally associate military greatness with aggressive, uncompromising forward movement. Taylor didn't conquer a heavily defended city. He sat in a shadowy room, asked uncomfortable questions, and drafted a midnight cable that killed a commanding officer's dream of a glorious conquest. The sheer institutional courage required to send that message, to be the lone voice saying stop while the entire Allied theater screamed go, is a quiet, unglamorous brand of heroism that rarely makes it into the blockbuster movies or the front pages of history books. In a culture that exclusively praises the warriors who relentlessly push the line, why are we so quick to forget the rare, principled leaders who are brave enough to pull us back from the edge? Maxwell Taylor is not a household name. He does not share the mythological, larger-than-life spotlight of commanders like Patton or MacArthur. His role in the Italian campaign did not involve a brilliant flanking maneuver, a defiant last stand, or a historic speech delivered to troops on the eve of battle. Instead, his heroism took the form of quiet, solitary calculation in the middle of a darkened, enemy-occupied room. Because of that single encrypted message sent in the dead of night, 3,000 American paratroopers lived to see the morning. They returned to their bases, stepped off their transport planes, and went back to waiting for the next mission. Most of them never knew they had been minutes away from a guaranteed massacre. They never knew whose message had turned their planes around, or what horrifying fate they had been saved from. Those same men went on to jump into the dark skies over Normandy on D-Day. They fought through the frozen, artillery-shattered forests of the Battle of the Bulge. They liberated Europe. Many of them would eventually fall in those later battles, but they died fighting on their own terms, in engagements where the odds were at least knowable and victory was possible. They did not die helplessly on the tarmac of Roman airfields in September 1943. The military decisions that make the front pages are almost always the ones where someone boldly says, yes, yes, we attack, yes, we hold the line, yes, we push forward. But perhaps the most profoundly difficult decisions in war and in life are the ones where someone has the iron-willed courage to look at the terrifying momentum of a catastrophic mistake and say, stop. When we look back at the grand sweep of history, it is easy to tally up the casualties of the battles that were fought. But how do we measure the immeasurable value of the lives saved by the battles someone was brave enough to cancel?